Hello? Oh, it's just for you, this microphone is just a prop, but I guess on Zoom, it's really helping Zoom hear me. So I hope you can hear me in the room. Yes? Okay. Hi everyone. I'm gonna take my mask like all the way off. Hi everyone. My name is Blair Fornwald, and I'm the director curator at the School of Art Gallery. And on behalf of the gallery, I am so pleased to welcome you all, and it's really great to see such a nice turnout for today's curatorial talk by Lillian O'Brien Davis. This talk is being presented in conjunction with Lillian's exhibition, The Performance of Shadows, which features work by Erica DeFreitas, Betty Saar, and Tim Whiten. That exhibition is going to open tonight at 5 o'clock. And it will run until April 29th. The exhibition is elegant and subdued and incredibly moving. Lillian is a fantastic curator and just a lovely human being. And so I hope that you can all join us and celebrate with her tonight. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that we are gathered here on Treaty 1 territory. The Anishinaabe, Nehiyaw, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene people were the original stewards of this land. And the Red River, which runs through present-day Winnipeg, is the heartland and birthplace of the Métis Nation. Treaty 1 was signed here at Lower Fort Garry in 1871 and took territory from 7 Anishinaabe and Nehiyaw First Nations to make the land available for settler use and ownership. Our water comes from the Shoal Lake 40 First Nation, which only last year ended its own boil water advisories. The Performance of Shadows is about, among many other things, other ways of knowing, trusting, intuiting, sensing, and feeling. It's about experiential and embodied ways of knowing that can provide tremendous insight and value, and are not always easily aligned with or incorporated into institutional systems and structures. We know that institutions are deeply rooted in colonialism, and we know that they privilege white, Eurocentric, and empirical ways of knowing and being, teaching, and learning. Can we imagine a radically expansive and decolonial future that honors and benefits from a diversity of spiritual, pedagogical, and epistemological perspectives? It's through this lens that I would like to affirm the gallery's commitment to working together in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration, so that we could bring that future closer to the present. The Performance of Shadows is the second exhibition that is presented as part of the School of Art Gallery's Visiting Curator program. This is an ambitious multi-year project that involves inviting 3 visiting curators, Grace Devaney, Lillian O'Brien Davis, and Shalaka Jad Huff, to research, develop, and present major exhibitions, outreach programming, and publications here at the University of Manitoba. This program aims to play a vital role in defining contemporary art and its attendant discourses in the prairies. And it will offer many opportunities, or it is offering currently, many opportunities for students, faculty, and community members alike to engage with curators who are charting bold new trajectories in their field. I want to thank the program's mentor, Grace Devaney, who has been actually the perfect person to create this new framework with. I think we've all benefited really tremendously from her intelligence and insight, her willingness to take risks, and her generosity and true kindness. The Visiting Curator program is also generously sponsored and supported by Michael F.B. Nesbitt, a champion of the arts throughout Winnipeg and beyond. And we are beyond grateful for his vision, support, and trust. I also want to acknowledge the generous support of the University of Manitoba, the School of Arts faculty and staff, donors, and volunteers for supporting this and the rest of the gallery's programming. Thank you in particular to our ASL interpreters from ECHO, who are helping us make this panel more accessible, and to the School of Arts staff members, especially Justin Baer, for his assistance in facilitating this talk. We're also live streaming and broadcasting this over Zoom and YouTube. And if anybody is having any trouble, please direct message the School of Art Gallery account, and Justin will try and help you out. And if you are watching on YouTube or Zoom and you have a question, you can post it there and we'll relay it to Lillian at the end of the talk. Yeah, so thank you everybody in the room for joining us and everybody for joining us online. And thanks for spending your lunch break with us. I'm just gonna do like a very quick bio. Lillian O'Brien Davis is the curator of exhibitions and public programs at Gallery 44. Center for Contemporary Photography in Toronto. She has curated projects at the Art Museum at the University of Toronto, Susan Hobbs Gallery, and the MacKenzie Art Gallery. And she is part of the 2023 Nuit Blanche Toronto Curatorial team. Her writing has appeared in BlackFlash, Canadian Art Online, C Magazine, and Peripheral Review, among other places. And the Performance of Shadows is actually Lillian's second exhibition for the School of Art Gallery. And I am really pleased to have the opportunity to work with you again. And of course, thank you, Lillian. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn it over.
Yeah. Okay, this is not amplifying, so just like kind of stick your hand in the air if you can't hear me. I'll try my best to project to the back of the room. And yeah, thank you to Blair, who is just such a wonderful curator in their own right, and also like a really nice mentor. So, you know, Grace is like a stupendous curator and thoughtful person and an excellent, you know, person to lead this program. But also Blair is just that as well. So yeah, I definitely recommend sort of like you know, embedding yourself in the School of Art Gallery programming and team if you're not as familiar. So if you were around for Grace's talk in the fall, she had artists here with her, and so unfortunately I wasn't able to have any of the artists from the show come because they are either very elderly and don't travel, or they are also teachers and work during the day. So Erica and I will be doing some programming in March. So I hope you can join us then. And so instead today, I'm going to do a curatorial talk about my practice, talk about sort of the way that I think about working with art, and then the show itself a little bit and how I got there. And is it up on the screen, hopefully? And because then we can get going. And yeah, if you have questions, but maybe we can ask them all at the end, but I also don't really mind being interrupted, but okay, cool. Hello. Stand by. I see Shalaka has entered the room. Hello, Shalaka, doing some crowd work. Nice to see you. Stay tuned for Shalaka's show coming up. Coming down the pipe very soon. Okay, hello. So we can go. So I wanted to talk about, so as Blair mentioned, I've done projects at the MacKenzie Art Gallery, and I worked there for a period of time as the assistant curator. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my time in Regina because sort of like established a relationship and like a reason why I'm here now in terms of like meeting Blair, but also like, you know, developing a relationship with the prairies. So I moved there in 2019, and yeah, you can flip to the next one, and was sort of had never like lived outside of Toronto, and was really just like getting my bearings and kind of like adapting to a very new place, and like a place that I like really loved. I was really like happy there, but like it was one of the like it was the first time I had ever worked for like an art institution. And so like I was getting to also understand like how institutions run and work, which we can also talk about kind of more in depth. But to say like I had a lot of questions, and I had a lot of like I observed things where I was like, oh, I wonder why that's done that way, and like how can we do it a little differently or change things. And like the MacKenzie is like one of the most interesting and like exciting art institutions in the country, I would say. So I no shade on them at all, but just like as a young person starting my career asking questions. So one of the things that I was sort of like given the opportunity to do like in my first like couple of months there was like work on like Black History Month programming. I wonder why. And I was sort of like not that interested in Black History Month. Like I think it like this idea of sort of like highlighting history, it's very important, but it's just not that like critically engaging. And so I started to think about like how would I do this? And so I came up with this film program that featured 3 films, Deep Implicancy by Denise Ferreira da Silva and Arjuna Newman, Paradise by Elizabeth Webb, and then Triangle Trade by Colleen Smith, Jerome Avba, and Camille Turner. And so the program investigated questions specific to sovereignty and belonging, asking where is paradise and to whom does it belong? And so I was much more interested in thinking about like this idea of access and belonging and sort of how specifically Black artists are thinking about these ideas. And so this screened for the duration of the month. So in addition to kind of all of the like typical Black History Month programming that was running, I sort of was able to like add my own sort of like injunction into it and sort of suggest like, you know, some of these films were looking at sort of like Afrofuturist concepts, but also just like troubling this idea of like, you know, a utopia or a utopic place where everything's like equal and sunny. So can hop to the next slide. So the next project I got to work on is called Connecting Through Grasses, and it was a solo show by Christina Battle, who's an Edmonton-based artist. And so this exhibition initially premiered in Manitoba, in Brandon, Manitoba, at the Art Gallery of Southwestern Manitoba. And I was invited to write an essay for it. And the curator, Alyssa Furon, who's now the director at the Dunlop, it was sort of like a Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, like 3 kind of like thinkers working in 3 different places connecting through this show. And the exhibition was looking at prairie grass systems and technologies that map and reflect the diminishing biome. So thinking about how we might map and define prairie boundaries anew. So kind of looking at these, you know, this prairie ecosystem, like the prairie grass, which we can all kind of picture and imagine, and thinking about, you know, I don't know, the ecological impacts of climate change on this environment, and how also those impacts are racialized. So I toured the show. I brought it to the MacKenzie. So this is like some install documentation. And this was sort of like a special and important moment for me because this was like the first like show that I got to do. So this is just like one image, and if you flip to the next one, there was like a film. So Christina's work is very you know, like she'll do like documentary films, and then there will be kind of like research, like ephemera and material that's like installed around the film. So I was really happy to bring this, and I mentioned this show also because like Christina, I have established a practice of working with artists like more than once. I did a class talk yesterday. I see some familiar faces, so you're going to hear some a bit of repetition, but this is something that I do in my practice because I'm building bonds of trust through this work. So I wrote about the show, then I brought it to Regina, and then our relationship was established, and I'll touch on a little later like where it went from there. So I was really having an opportunity to do like a show at this scale in the MacKenzie, like in one of their galleries, and also getting a taste of like working on with a team that big. So we can flip to the next one. So I was happy at the MacKenzie. It's a large institution. I'm part of a big team there. But I was really hungry to like actually do my own curatorial work. Like doing Christina's show, I was like, this is what I want to be doing. Like, this is it. And so an opportunity arose for me to go back to Toronto and to work at Gallery 44, which the full title is Center for Contemporary Photography. And I took it because I wanted to do my own programming, and I actually had a suite of programming in my mind that I wanted to do. And so like kind of came in with this proposal. So Justin, if you want to flip to the next one. So the suite of programming was 4 solo shows that are interconnected like conceptually, kind of thinking like, racialized women artists, exploring a relationship to land and the environment. It was sort of like the elevator pitch. And so the first show was Suzanne Morissette, who was someone that I connected with also like through my Regina pals. And so her exhibition, What Does Good Work Look Like, was exploring kind of what constitutes Indigenous art histories and how Indigenous people are often made to fit within existing disciplinary knowledge. So Suzanne is a professor at OCAD and is like a very accomplished scholar, but a lot of our discussions are around sort of becoming a mother, becoming more in touch with her like Indigenous knowledges, and wanting to kind of like connect her familial knowledge and her cultural knowledge and have it find like a legitimate place, in addition to kind of this like institutional academic framework that she existed within. And so she laid these questions in the Humber River as it like flowed back home here to Treaty 1. And actually, shout out that you might encounter this show shortly at Blinkers in the summer. So if you're interested in Suzanne's work, which I suggest looking more into her practice, you might be able to see it in person very soon. And then the next exhibition in the suite was Tia Simone Gardner, Dark and Perfect Memories. So Tia Simone was an artist that I encountered through the work of scholar Catherine McKittrick, who's a Black geographer. And so this exhibition explored the legacy of the Mississippi River, which is the largest watershed in North America, and its relationship to the transatlantic slave trade and the development of the United States economy. So thinking about landscape as a tool of oppression, and also the formation of oppositional geographies where Black people are treated as economic objects. So the shores of the Mississippi becoming this site of like transition between, free people being sort of like kidnapped and like sold into slavery, and then also enslaved people, escaping via the river and finding freedom either by traveling north or just like disguising themselves as a free laborer and getting away. So the slave ship becoming a location of Black subjectivity, human terror, and Black resistance. And then the next show, Elizabeth Webb, A Bearing Tree as a Witness. So Elizabeth and I had connected initially in 2019. I screened her film at the MacKenzie, and then in that conversation, she had mentioned this body of research that she was doing, which resulted in this exhibition. So we were able to present it in Toronto. And so it examined the plat maps and field notes of the original land surveys of her family's former plantation in eastern Alabama. And then she did a film, which isn't in this documentation, but there was a 16mm film. But I'm looking at my notes. To basically look at how like the natural elements on this land, so the trees and the soil and the plants, help to kind of like undermine or provide like liberatory models about how to subvert systems of power and control. So thinking about how, the growth of a tree sort of subverts how like land surveying and mapping is done in a particular area, and how that might sort of be a metaphor for our own body's ways of subverting categorization or I don't know, being colonized. And the next and final iteration of this project or this series was The Air We Breathe, Christina Battles. So once again, kind of like continuing that relationship together. And so this was a single channel documentary, and then like additional research material, which you see in this image, exploring the complexities of air pollution. And so thinking about how different areas in the city, air pollution is better or worse, and those areas that are with worse air pollution are usually in proximity to like, industrial plants, and those are also neighborhoods that are typically racialized. So she was specifically looking at Edmonton, But of course, this is something that impacts any kind of like major city or where there's like a large population of people. So this is sort of like an overview of like, yeah, my relationship to Regina. I was there. I had an excellent experience being there and sort of like developed a relationship with the prairies. And then coming to Toronto, wanting to kind of like establish myself and my curatorial voice through this series. And then if you want to flip, so because you can't sustain yourself with one job in the arts, I also have like an independent practice. So that kind of has taken a very different like track than A, I expected, and B, like than my kind of like day job. So if you want to flip to the first one. So when I finished grad school, I was really like at a loss as to like what to do next. Obviously, like I had a job, but that didn't necessarily mean that I had any sense of like what I do in terms of like, you know, what do I contribute? And so that became something I was trying really hard to figure out. And so I kind of was like really interested in these two artists, Katie Lyle and Ella Dawn McGuff's work. Like I knew them both, I had met them both. I was really thinking about their work and it kept coming to me. And particularly like Katie would paint these paintings that had like hands in them. And I was like really like, my anxiety kind of like manifests a lot in like my hands and touching things. And so we met. I kind of like reached out to them and we had a group studio visit, and I sort of was like, I have this idea for like a project. I think we could work together. Would you be interested? And they were both down. And initially it was because I had also been approached by this like Toronto gallerist who was trying to like do this project space, and he kind of wanted me to do a show there, and it didn't work out. So then we ended up working together. The artist and I ended up still working together, but we just like didn't have a home for this project that was sort of growing and growing. And so the show also became an opportunity for me to like get away from like explicitly talking about certain concepts. So like explicitly discussing race basically. And so I was like, I have other ideas. Like I also want to like explore my relationship to contemporary art in a way that isn't as sort of like tied to my like flesh. So this show kind of became an opportunity for me to just like try something, and the artists were super down, and it was like this, we described it as like a 3-person collaboration, and we read a lot of like Anne Carson, and this idea of kind of like this like triangular kind of like working relationship became like very much a part of the show, where like we installed everything together, we made all of the decisions together, which was like super obnoxious for anyone who was trying to help us, but it was very important to us. And so the show itself is sort of thinking about touch and the kind of like anxiety around touch. And then like, you know, so anyway, we got to do this iteration at Susan Hobbs Gallery in Toronto. This was the first time we got to do it. And we kind of did get to like dive into the, you know, we literally did installed everything, the three of us. It was a bit ridiculous, but it turned out, and we felt really good about it. And so we wanted to continue the relationship. So if you'll go to the next slide, thanks. We got to bring it to the School of Art Gallery. And so in this kind of like trio relationship, we invited another artist, Gabrielle Larondelle Hill. And that was sort of also important to us in terms of sort of like getting out of this sort of like close knitness. And so Gabrielle's contribution really shifted the show, but also like she wasn't very available. I think she just had a baby and was able to like kind of send work, but wasn't able to kind of like get into this like brain space with us, which was fine. I think it needed to be kind of like broken open a little bit. But it premiered here, and we weren't able to be here because it was during the COVID lockdown where we couldn't come into the province. So Blair and Brooks did all of the install, but it turned out great. So maybe some of you caught it. And then if you'll go to the third slide, and then so we did it one last time. And I don't have a date on this one, but I think it was like December 2021 that we did this in London, Ontario at Support Gallery. And so this third iteration, Katie had just had a baby, so it was just me and Ella doing this. But I think like, is this a successful series? Like, I think that this was an opportunity to do experimental like curatorial work and sort of like understand a relationship to artists in terms of like how to work together, how I want to work with people, how art, like what is art, like, you know, how do you make shows, like working through a lot of those ideas. So, I mean, maybe I'm being a bit vague. We can talk more about it if people are interested, but I think I wanted to highlight it as part of my independent practice in terms of like, you know, the way that I also just kind of like ask questions and try stuff. And like luckily can connect with people who are sort of trusting and willing to do it with me. And also like to teach me things. Like Katie and Ella and Gabrielle are all like very established artists and very accomplished. So I was really, I did not feel like the authority in that situation. I was very much like learning from that at every moment. If you want to go to the next slide. So on the other side of the kind of like spectrum of like independent work that I do, so is this exhibition called Conceptions of White. So this is something that I began working on when I still was like employed with the MacKenzie, with my co-curator, John Hampton. And so this, and after I left to go to Gallery 44, it was agreed that I could still co-curate this show with John because I had put so much work into it already. And so this exhibition looks at the nuances of white identity and traces them through art history, and then also looks at contemporary reflections of whiteness as an identity category. So it involves like historical works, like big institutional loans, as well as like contemporary art commissions. And then one of the things that we did, which is why I have this screen cap, is, you know, this research started in like 2018, 2019. But in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, people were really hungry for resources and were really like looking for access to materials. So John and I decided to release like a portion of our research to the public, which is obviously not necessarily that common. Like you usually do a book with the show or after the show, but we were sort of like, we're going to do this sort of almost blog essentially where people can like, you know, access all of the links we were reading about, because we wanted to keep the emphasis on like white people thinking about themselves and like, or, you know, maybe they could stand to not think about themselves that much, but like thinking about whiteness as it pertains to like the issues that we're dealing with. And then also, I don't know, there were just some good resources. So we shared that. You want to hop to the next one? So just some installation footage. I won't talk too much about it, but yeah, this show was a big like learning moment for me in terms of thinking about how to make exhibitions, like, and my relationship to research. Like this show was sort of extremely research forward, as opposed to my projects with Katie and Ella, which were very kind of experimental and like embodied. And there was, you know, a huge amount of historical work that went into it. I'm sort of like, do I talk about the objects? Not if you want to know more about the content of this show. Okay, no nods. No one moved their head. Okay, so we'll keep moving. Cool. Well, some people are interested in that exhibition. But yeah, so like the scope of the research, it's a large group show. Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Blair. Some favorites. So in this image that you're looking at right now, the Apollo Belvedere was like a significant like focus for the exhibition in terms of like it intersects with many of the kind of like topics that we were interested in. So the sort of like wrong turn of art history where like Roman marble statues that were copies of Greek bronzes were wrongly considered like finished when they were completely white. And so like Johann Winkelmann, the kind of like famous art historian, wrote all of this, like, I don't know, wrote about these statues saying like the whiteness of the marble reflects like the kind of pinnacle of beauty, and therefore anything that can attempt to arrive at this level of whiteness is considered like the pinnacle of beauty. So like white flesh being as beautiful as this white marble. But of course he was incorrect because these were painted, therefore kind of like crumbling that whole kind of like trajectory of thought. Or that the Apollo's face is has been used in a lot of like facial typography in terms of kind of saying like, oh, the structure of this face is the most symmetrical and therefore the most perfect and therefore the most beautiful and most intelligent. They must contain the highest level of intelligence. And so, then comparing it to people from other places in the world who have different facial features and saying, oh, you must be, less intelligent or, whatever, because you don't look like this. So we were interested in sort of the role of Apollo, and also like the Anglo-Saxon myth, which is this sort of like myth of whiteness, that like there's a lineage of power and like relation between like the Greek, the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, and then the Americans, and that they are like inheritors of power and social capital as a result of this. This is a false myth, of course, but one that sort of like maybe isn't like literally perpetuated anymore, but I think sort of like suffuses a lot of like I don't know, scholarship. You want to skip to the next slide? What time is it? We good for time? And so in the back, you'll see a Deanna Bowen piece, which was a constellation that she made of work that reflected the three institutions where the show is traveling. So it opened in Regina, which is where this documentation is from, at the MacKenzie. It's currently open at the Art Museum at the University of Toronto, and then it'll be traveling to the Vancouver Art Gallery in the fall. So the constellation of the series of frames on the wall reflect the kind of threads of white supremacy in terms of like Canadian identity and nation building, and then their relationship to art institutions, and in particular the three art institutions where the show is happening. So that was something that was really like people reacted to it, people were interested in it. It's not depicted in this shot, but there is like a piece of documentation that Deanna found that was like Tommy Douglas's like master's thesis, which was like a thesis that he wrote about eugenics and like the benefits of eugenics, which were understood as like a force for social good because you would like eliminate crime and poverty by doing these practices. And then, this was sort of like in the 30s. And then when all of the information and news started coming out of Europe about the kind of atrocities that the Nazis had, done, a lot of people, including T.C. Douglas, like backed away from their positions on eugenics. And so when he was in office, actually voted down a bill that would have kind of implemented some of these practices. Not to say that they aren't enacted in some places in Canada today. So just, some details. Can roll to the next slide. Oh, better shot of Deanna's work. Can roll to the next one. There's a Fred Wilson. Can keep rolling. Barbara Maneely. So she is a Regina artist. We wanted to have a local artist engage in the exhibition. So this is a project that she did by tracing the parameters of Treaty 4, which is like kind of roughly southern Saskatchewan. I think it like creeps into Manitoba a tiny bit. It's like an oblong shape-ish. So she is a cartographer but by training, and so drove the parameter and then drew it. And so thinking about the concept of white land, which is a development term that refers to land that can't be built on. So like crown land is white land. So yeah, I think this piece kind of like, addressed a lot of the kind of like local concerns with relation to kind of to whiteness. And some of the thinking that I did about the show was thinking about whiteness like within 3 categories, which is like the possessive, the corrective, and death. So like European relationship to whiteness around possession. So like, the British Museum sort of like acquiring all these objects through like looting and stealing. And then corrective being kind of like the legacy of residential schools and sort of like forcing people towards a standard which is whiteness. And then death being sort of like, I don't know, we understand that one, I think, like murder. So we can roll to the next slide. So just some more documentation of this exhibition. Yeah, want to go to the next one. So this is a Jen Chan piece called the Aryan Recognition Toolkit. So also looking at kind of like facial typography as understood through the lens of the Nazis, and like undermining it, of course, like sort of suggesting how ridiculous it is. So you could scan your face and it would tell you the percentage of Aryan in that you are. We can roll to the next one. A Nicholas Galinan piece. And the next one, and Jeremy Bailey, White Simple. Okay. Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about the performance of shadows. So yeah, so we've gone through kind of like my independent practice in terms of sort of like the large scale research project, which was like I did with John Hampton. We worked together. And so it's very much reflective of both of our curatorial practices. John is someone who is, an incredible researcher, an incredibly thoughtful person. And then my practice is a little bit more sort of like emotional and what I began to talk about as like intuitive. And so we both kind of contributed to the exhibition conceptions of white in different ways. But I learned a lot from that process. And so the performance of shadows came out of like my time basically at the MacKenzie when I was thinking about like the shows that I wanted to do, or like the kind of show that I wanted to do, and also like kind of a fraught relationship with research where like I don't think I fully understood like how to articulate like the kind of work that I'm interested in doing. So my series that I did with Katie and Ella, like we did research in the sense of like, we read a few articles, but like the show itself didn't come from text. It didn't come like it came from us and our bodies. And so I was sort of like, okay, what is that? Like, what is that? And like, how do I articulate that? Like, how do I make that something a little bit more legitimate? Because, as I kind of gained more confidence in my curatorial work, I realized like that was something and that I could kind of like own it. And so I started with Erica. If you want to flip to the next slide, thank you. I started with Erica because she is someone that I've known since 2018. She's an artist that I've had a really like sustained working relationship with. And during the pandemic, I was sort of like for a period of time alone in Regina, sort of like hole up in my apartment, just like going a bit nuts. And we would speak on the phone and we sent each other postcards a few times and stuff. Like we were really connecting. And then one day I came across this article from the Smithsonian that was talking about this find in Pompeii. And the find was what you're looking at on the screen, this collection of objects that they referred to as a sorceress's kit. And I was like enraptured. It was like the shortest article. And I was like, I tried to find more. There wasn't anything. It was just kind of like this like short news item announcing this new discovery in Pompeii. And I was like, a sorceress? Are you like, so you're like, what? Like, it was just like, I had so many questions and they listed some of the objects. They didn't identify all of them. There's like an Egyptian, like kind of tiny like statue in the mix. Just like I was totally blown away. And the way that it was presented too, the sort of constellation of objects, like really spoke to me. And I was just thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it. And I talked to Erica about it. And so if you'll flip to the next one, Erica started telling me about this project that she was working on, which was for like a C magazine feature called Arrivée avant moi devant moi. And it was this series of images. So this is just one of 8. And she was working on this sort of like sustained project of looking for or like establishing connections with these 2 women, Jean Duval and Maud Salter. So Jean Duval was a model and an actress, a beauty who was the lover of Charles Baudelaire, the poet. And she was a Black woman. It's sort of not much is known about her because, no one bothered to sort of like keep any records of her. When Charles Baudelaire died, his mother burned all of her letters. So we have his letters to Jean, but we don't have her answers or her letters. And so her voice was sort of like erased through that gesture. No one knows where she's buried. Probably somewhere in Paris. Like she just completely is absented from history. And then Maud Salter is a more contemporary artist. She passed away in 2008. And so she had dedicated a lot of her practice to like finding Jean and working with Jean's image. But then she died prematurely from cancer, and sort of like her project was cut off. And she didn't kind of like finish. So Erica, and sort of like the infinite tenderness that is like Erica's practice, is like picks up this mantle and like continues this search and like continues this gesture of reaching out and making connections with these women. And so she told me about this, and I was like totally like emotional about it. And so it kind of like resonated with me in connection with this sorceress's kid. And so I ended up writing about both of these things together, and this kind of like female world building as this kind of like gesture of kindness and also of protection. But it also kind of like continued to like pull at this part of me that was like, okay, like this made like how did I get here? Like how did I kind of make these connections between this piece and like it was so emotional. Like how do I articulate this is I guess what I'm trying to say. Like how do I kind of put this into words? And this article helped me in some ways and sort of also opened up like my interest in diving into this more. If you want to flip one more. So there just an example. So this is a Felix Nadar portrait of an unknown woman that is Jean Duval. And then this is a Maud Salter artwork and collage where she is working with that image of Jean. So just an example of both of those artists. So ectoplasm. So I was sort of thinking about this connection or like, how to articulate my relationship to this kind of work. And I, heard about this opportunity to do the visiting curator program, and the Hamilton Archive was sort of like something I was interested in and reading about. And so if you're not familiar, Thomas Hamilton was like a Winnipeg doctor who, after the death of his son from the Spanish flu in like 1919 or 1918 or something like that, sort of became very invested in like spiritualism and seances. And his first medium was his Scottish nurse or a Scottish nanny who like the nanny to his kids. And so like I was interested in this, and I think there's actually an exhibition forthcoming from Serena Kishevsky, if I pronounce that correctly, about this archive. So if you're really interested, you can engage with it that way. But the piece that engaged me the most was like that the first medium was a Scottish immigrant nanny. And I was like, that's so cool. Because for me, what I thought was like, okay, this is someone who is disempowered as someone who's coming to this country and working for another family and sort of like trying to find a life, but is sort of like, you know, categorized within this kind of like, I don't know, foreign category. And she's using spiritualism or like a cult to sort of like gain power, like in terms of like an additional like, you know, connection to another world or to another part of the world that we don't see every day, but also to access social power. And I was like, okay, there's like, I'm making connections here. I'm making connections between like the amulets and the sorceress's kit and how these are things that are protecting you from, you know, I don't know, unseen things, but they're also giving you a community of women who are like sort of protecting each other within this like, you know, very patriarchal society. And then that kind of like, you know, building social, I don't know, building kind of safe connections and spaces between Erica and Maud and Jean, and then learning about this sort of like nanny who is also kind of like using the occult to kind of create, you know, like I don't know, a platform for herself and safety for herself. And so I became like really interested in this way that like intuition or kind of like embodied intelligence could be adapted or like seen as this like practice of empowerment, which I find it is like a funny word because I'm not talking about like girl power, but like yeah, and so I kind of I wanted to like dig into this more. So that's sort of like how I proposed my residency here. And then if you want to flip to the next one. And then so that sort of like led me back. So Erica was the first artist that I thought of because I've been thinking about her work always. And she is sort of thinking like her approach to these practices or to these ideas that I'm kind of like fumbling around with are kind of like connected to the divine feminine. So I think that's kind of like evident in terms of like how she worked with Jean and Maud. And then and this piece will be in the show, Something Else is Happening, which like is a video of the sun with testimonials of people who have seen like miracles of the Virgin Mary. And so thinking about how like, I don't know, religion is like one kind of like pathway into this in terms of like a relationship to something that is beyond us, that is bigger than us, that, you know, is kind of miraculous. Erica is not religious herself, but she's using the like Mary as this sort of like another example of the divine feminine in addition to the other kind of like women that she engages with in her practice. Next slide. And then Betty Saar, I was trying to actually remember how I became acquainted with Betty for the first time. Like, I think it wasn't in my art history degree, but I came across her work and I was like totally like enamored. And I've been thinking about it for a long time. So I never anticipated that I would be able to like directly work with her like work and ever show her work, but there is a piece by Betty Saar downstairs right now. So I encourage you all to see it. But she was born in Pasadena in 1926. So she's 96 years old and she still lives in LA. I was really blown away by her work. And I think it sort of like directly addresses a lot of the ideas or like kind of feelings that I've been having. So this is just a picture of her in front of the Watts Towers, which are kind of like important to her and a place that I visited while I was trying to get close to her. If you want to flip to the next slide. So the Watts Towers are built by someone named Simon Rodia. And so he's not an architect, so they're like these like amazingly massive sculptural pieces that are still in Watts in LA. And it's all kind of like collage and I don't know, what is that called? Mosaic. And you see like seashells and glass and I don't know, pots, like pieces of terracotta pots and stuff. So this was sort of Betty talks about how this was a very influential piece for her because she grew up kind of like, I think her grandparents lived in Watts, so she grew up at a time where these were being built, so they were sort of a background or a backdrop to her life and her, first encounter with art. Want to flip to the next one. And then another kind of influence in Betty's work is Joseph Cornell, who's an American artist who worked like kind of like assemblage surrealism kind of pieces. So you'll see kind of a lot of influence of Cornell's work in Betty's work. You want to flip to the next one. So these are sort of like examples of Betty's practice, kind of using found materials like an old window, and then the kind of like importance and the symbolism, like occult symbolism that appears in her work. So like zodiac signs, stars, phrenology, palmistry, like hands are very important to Betty's work. So this kind of call back to my like obsession with hands. If you want to flip again. Okay, maybe flip back then. I won't talk about Tim yet. And so Betty was another example of, looking at a relationship to things that are beyond kind of like rational knowledge, that she, like her relationship to the occult, her relationship to magic, to palmistry, like she's directly engaging in things that are kind of outside of this like scientific world of matter. And so like where Erica is treading this kind of like path that picks up like spirituality, Betty is treading this path that focuses on the occult, and they both are kind of coming together to address like, I don't know, many different layers in terms of my interest in sort of like intuition being this like language for what is beyond language. What does it make? I don't know. Yes. And then Tim, the third artist in the constellation, was an artist that I came across a couple of years ago, I think, and I admired from afar. His work is sort of like completely stupendous. Like it's really unbelievable. And I have like, I'm very interested in like, for someone who works at a photography gallery, like I'm really interested in like the materiality of objects. And so I was also like extremely drawn to his work. And so I was like, okay, I need to follow this. I need to get to know his work a bit more, like, because I'm just so interested in it, like as objects. And of course, that sort of opened up like learning about Tim's work, which is sort of, he has like a background in psychology, an interest in phenomenology. So kind of like, looking at what is beyond us, beyond kind of like I don't know, what, let me refer to my notes. Looking at fields of meaning and significance that cannot be properly understood if restricted to like the objective world purely in terms of matter and motion. So Tim kind of encourages his viewer to do a lot of the engagement in the moment with the work. So he's like, you have to come to it, and whatever you get from it is enough, and that's what you should get from it. So I would encourage you, when you encounter his work, look at its form, look at the title, see what the work is telling you, and whatever it is that you're told or what you receive from the work, he'll be pleased with that. So there's this one, and then I just have two examples. I didn't want to like show too much from the show, but these will be in the show. But when lit, they look kind of like absolutely magical. So yeah, just to circle back, like I think, to summarize, this exhibition has 3 artists who sort of like deal with concepts that are like outside of language and require a different kind of interpretation, which I'm suggesting is sort of like an embodied intelligence that we're all able to use and enact. We just need to kind of like open up ourselves in order to kind of accept and interpret. I think that this is something that we can nurture in ourselves, and I think that it is something that has been muted or has been restricted within our bodies, and especially within racialized bodies, because of like colonial anxiety, right? Like colonizers can control, like, I don't know, they can control where you are, they can control who you interact with, what you do, but this sort of like ephemeral traces of like ritual or practice cannot be contained or regulated in the same way, which is, I mean, like why certain, like, I don't know, obeah practices in the Caribbean were forbidden, for instance, or like, the kind of like, I don't know, all the kind of like, what is it, the potash bands, potlash? Oh God, I won't, anyway. The whole exhibition is like looking to kind of reopen these channels and to provide a series of artists, and I keep referring to it as a constellation because that's the language I prefer, of artists who are doing this work and who might, prompt us to therefore think in those terms. So that's from me. We can maybe open up for questions. Do we have time? Okay. Are there any? Yeah. Hi.
I want to ask, like, how do you find balancing your practice, like commercially, and your other practice? Because you said you have like your practice with the galleries and then your own independent work. Like, how do you find balancing those two? And do you feel like they are always balanced, or is it one or the other?
It's difficult. They're not always balanced. I think it's not an easy contrast, but I think it's really, I think it's really important for me to maintain an independent practice because it's very much in my control in terms of like what I'm working on. So I appreciate that and I like that. So though it's extremely difficult in terms of just like time management and like finding time to take rest, it's something that I kind of consistently keep picking up. So I think there are very sort of like accomplished people who maybe have found like a better rhythm to manage it all, but it's something that I sort of like have to keep working on. Any other cues? Hey, Blair.
Hello.
Hey.
I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about your beautiful title for the exhibition.
Oh yeah, I never talked about the title. So I read this book called The Deepest Eye, I think, Bluest Eye. And it was the passage that I was reading was talking about how like basically like the importance of visibility and like here, I'll tell you right now. Yeah, the passage was talking about sort of like pushing against the supposition that seeing is believing, and that like visibility is very important, and that instead like these things that take place in the shadows or that appear sort of in these sort of, I don't know, moments of beyond, are kind of where like kind of liberation happens or exists. And so like the performance of shadows being this reference to what takes place in the shadows, or like in that unseeable place. Thanks, Blair.
And like maybe one follow-up question.
Yeah.
It seems like this exhibition and this exhibition is kind of asks a lot of the viewer, because it asks us to kind of reorient our vision, towards the shadows, or towards like attuning ourselves to our own intuitions and trusting that our own interpretations of work that is maybe kind of esoteric is also maybe correct or good.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how you as a curator attempt to kind of guide the viewer in that direction, or kind of make it okay for the viewer.
Yeah. I think I've been trying different approaches. Like when I did my like master's thesis exhibition, I was like, no text. That's the answer. No information. And then everyone was like, that's not a good idea. And so I did some text. And so like in this exhibition, there are labels. But I think like I learned a lot from Tim. Like Tim is someone who in conversation, like the way he talks about his work is like incredibly generous. Like he makes the work so that like the people who are seeing the work like receive this message, and like not even this message, a message. Like it is like this channel of communication that is like so kind and so like, deeply generous. And so like, therefore he has like he's not very interested in interpretation. And like, I was talking about this with some friends, and we were talking about like sort of the lenses by which you kind of like interpret work or read a work, and how we're comfortable with a particular lens, which is looking at sort of like the artist's biography and sort of like interpolating the work within that. And Tim is not very interested in that. Like he doesn't want you to talk about that when you're talking about his work. And so I think like what I tried to do with this show was kind of like suggest like that you might need to try a different lens to read the work. So, hopefully like, but also like it's an experiment. Like maybe it didn't work, and that's okay. Because like maybe I'll figure something out eventually, or not. Like that's also okay. So we'll see. TBD maybe is the answer. Yeah. Any other questions? Anything from Zoom?
We have some Zoom questions.
Zoom cues.
Okay, so
Hi to everyone on Zoom. Thank you for joining.
we have a question from Mel. What is it like working with Betty Saar, and how was her work in the show Chosen?
What was it like working with Betty Saar? So Betty reviews proposals, but I didn't get to work with her one-on-one because of her status as a senior artist. She reviews proposals, but she doesn't always like directly engage. So this piece came from MSU Broad. I was going to say like a museum. It came from an art gallery. And what was the second half of that question? How was it selected?
Yeah. How was her work in the show Chosen? Yeah.
So it wasn't easy because when you're just an independent curator from Toronto and no one knows who you are, nobody answers your emails when you email a big museum. But luckily, Grace connected us with MSU. They had some Betty Saar works in their collection. And I was particularly interested in sort of like 70s and 80s artworks for Betty Saar, because she, like after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, her work becomes like increasingly politicized and like politically engaged. I think if anyone knows Betty Saar's work, like her most famous piece is like I forget the full title, but the like Aunt Jemima piece that you might be able to, liberation of Aunt Jemima. So that's 1972. So I was sort of like, my ambition was to have a piece from this era of Betty's practice that was kind of like, I don't know, the birth of her political consciousness, or like her public political consciousness. So the piece was selected because it fit into also that time period that I was really interested in. And it also, like, it has a hand in it, like it has a lot of the kind of symbolism that she uses frequently that I was hoping to use and demonstrate in this exhibition.
Awesome. Okay, so we have another question by Ray Swan.
Anyway,
Do you have any other book recommendations in the theme of racialized people / mysticism / spiritualism, or essays?
The Deepest Eye was the one I read. The Deepest Eye is the one I read, that where I got the Performance of Shadows text or title. I do have some books. I'm not going to remember them off the top of my head. There's a book about seances that specifically talks about the Hamilton Archive. That one's a really great one. I read a book about the Luminous Brotherhood, which is a group of seance practitioners from New Orleans, racialized seance practitioners, who would hold seances and sort of bring back like figures from history. Like they brought back like Napoleon, and he was like, I'm in hell, and like I regret everything I did, and like I support your cause. So that one was like absolutely fascinating. So if you send me an email, I will get you those titles because I can't remember them off the top of my head.
Can I put it in the chat?
Okay. Maybe DM. Oh yeah, there's the visiting curator email. That can
Yes.
be the one.
We'll put the visiting curator one in the
Yeah,
in the
then
chat.
you can reach me there. Any more questions?
I hope I'm not monopolizing, but you mentioned New Orleans, and I know that you and Shalaka went to New Orleans as part of this residency, and I actually haven't spoken a lot to you about your time there, and I
Yeah.
was wondering if being in that city and community with Grace and Shalaka had any influence on the trajectory of this exhibition.
Yeah. It did. So we as part of this program, we traveled to New Orleans in like the spring of 2022. I think, yeah. 21, 22. In the recent past. Yeah, in January, the spring, Ontario spring. Yeah. And so that was for Prospect, which is a triennial that Grace was the associate curator of. And I think like I was really excited to go for the exhibition, but also because New Orleans has a very like close relationship with like spiritualism and the occult and kind of like, I don't know, Catholicism. And Louisiana is sort of like a very poignant place, where I found it to be so. And so there was like an entire kind of installation in one of the galleries that was part of Prospect that was looking at sort of like New Orleans, like kind of like history of spiritualism and like voodoo in particular. And so I found that to be like incredibly moving. I don't know if it had like any kind of like direct impact on the exhibition that you will see tonight, but there was like a lot of kind of like incredibly poignant moments, like seeing like objects that were buried with someone that were sort of like exhumed to be part of like an older installation, and like kind of working through how you deal with that, or like histories of like spiritualists who would who were racialized, but once again, like using their skills to kind of cross color boundaries to heal white people, and as well as it like kind of like build community with the local indigenous population. So there were a lot of experiences that way that I think I was like kind of like finding like additional layers of like legitimacy to like some of the ideas that I was having by being like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm seeing this appear in another place. So I think that was like really important and formative. And we were there for the unveiling of Simone Lee's installation Mami Wata, which was this like beautiful monument that was placed at the base of this like tall pillar that used to have a Robert E. Lee monument on it. That commemorated like the attempted like coup of like all of these like Confederates. And then that was taken down in 2017, and it was just this like empty pillar. And then Simone Lee, this like wonderful sculptor, created this beautiful sculpture that was dedicated to Mami Wata, which she's like a spirit of the Atlantic, basically, that like is like a mermaid and also like protects all of the people who died in the crossing, the transatlantic crossing. So it was sort of like, I mean, me and Shalaka were like bawling our damn eyes out. So it was like really poignant. So these sort of like these kind of like moments that I think contributed a lot to like affect of the show, I think too. Yeah. Any more questions? Any more questions? Yes, please.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, it's more of a comment and a compliment to you, but the way that you're like describing your curatorial practice, this like relinquish of like guidance, I think really fits with what I understand the theme of this exhibition to be, like talking about this inherited like inner magic and inner belief. I think that's just really beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah, and question portion of it would be, do you think that like in your opinion, artists that you've selected, do you think that they respond directly to like these ideas, or do you think they're like tackling the same idea in like their own separate ways? And is there an intention behind that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So if anyone didn't hear, just like, do the artists respond all like to the idea in the same way, or do they kind of tackle it in their own ways? And I think that they all tackle it in their own ways, which is also kind of like what is interesting in my opinion. Like, and that was something I kind of had to arrive at. Like at first I was trying to kind of like have this umbrella and then fit the artist under the umbrella. And then I think it was Tim who really challenged me on that and was sort of like, no, I don't associate with this language. And so it was like, okay, well, I know this works. So like, how does it work? And sort of finding a rhythm that made more sense, which was that, okay, they're all approaching this in a really, like in a specific way and through different language and different concepts. But I think like the core of it sort of like, enforces a thesis that I think is like compelling. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very cool. Any other cues?